Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at how Indigenous wisdom can really help us shape policy and governance for a more sustainable future.
Yeah.
And we're going to be focusing specifically on Chapter 5 of Roots of Resilience, Indigenous Wisdom for Sustainable Futures.
Oh,
And this chapter really dives deep into policy, governance, and Indigenous rights.
sounds good.
So are you ready to jump in?
Yeah, let's get into it.
Okay, great. So one of the things that really struck me in this chapter was how it emphasizes the need to shift from policies that often overlook Indigenous knowledge to ones that actually recognize and value it. You know, it's like we've been trying to solve these complex environmental problems without even considering the perspectives of the people who have been living in these ecosystems for generations.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this chapter really drives home the point that Indigenous knowledge isn't just some sort of quaint folklore. It's a sophisticated body of knowledge that's been developed and refined over centuries. It's about understanding the intricate relationships between humans and the natural world. And it's absolutely essential for creating truly sustainable solutions.
And, you know, one of the key takeaways for me was how important secure Indigenous land rights are
Yeah.
for effective sustainable management.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
The chapter brings up this really compelling example from Australia, the Indigenous Protected Areas, or IPAs.
Right.
And these are areas where Indigenous communities have been given the power to protect and manage these vast tracts of land using their traditional knowledge.
Yeah, and what's so cool about the IPAs is that they're not just about preservation.
Right.
They're about active management. You
Yeah.
know, they're actually leading to these incredible conservation outcomes.
It's like they're showing the world that recognizing Indigenous land rights isn't just about social justice.
Yeah.
It's actually a vital ingredient for successful conservation.
Absolutely. And I think the success of IPAs really boils down to this idea of giving communities control over their lands and letting them apply that traditional knowledge that's been honed over generations.
It makes you wonder what we could achieve if we applied this model more broadly. Right?
Yeah, definitely.
Like, what if we truly listened to and learned from the people who've been the stewards of these lands for centuries?
Well, that's a really powerful question, and it leads us to another really important point that this chapter brings up, which is participatory policymaking.
Yes.
We can't just expect Indigenous knowledge to magically solve all our problems.
Right.
We need to actually include Indigenous voices at every single stage of the policy process.
Yeah, not just as consultants, but as true partners in
Right.
shaping the agenda.
Exactly.
Because they have so much invaluable knowledge and expertise to contribute. And the chapter actually mentioned some really interesting examples of this in action. Like in the Arctic, for example,
Oh.
where Indigenous communities are partnering with scientists to document the impacts of climate change and develop adaptation strategies.
Yeah, these collaborative research projects are so important because they bring together scientific data with Indigenous observations and knowledge, which ultimately leads to a much more comprehensive understanding of the challenges and, I think, more effective and culturally appropriate solutions.
It's a good reminder that sometimes the best solutions come from combining different ways of knowing. And this makes me think about the importance of respecting and supporting Indigenous governance systems.
Yeah.
You know, if we really want to strengthen community-led conservation, we have to support the systems that have worked for these communities for generations.
Yeah, for sure. And a great example of this is the Sami Parliament in Scandinavia.
Oh, yeah.
They've actually managed to integrate Indigenous self-determination within the national framework. So they have a real voice in matters that directly impact their cultural heritage, their lands, and their resources.
It's really a testament to the fact that Indigenous autonomy can exist within a larger governance structure.
Absolutely.
And, you know, all of this brings us to another critical issue that's raised in the chapter, which is protecting Indigenous knowledge from exploitation.
Yes, definitely.
It's not enough to just acknowledge its value. We have to actually ensure that it's not misused or appropriated for profit without proper recognition and benefit sharing.
It's about respecting Indigenous intellectual property rights.
Yeah, exactly.
And the chapter mentions the Nagoya Protocol, which is an international agreement that's aimed at ensuring fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from the use of Indigenous knowledge.
Right, especially in areas like biodiversity conservation and drug discovery.
Yeah, the Nagoya Protocol is definitely a step in the right direction, I think. It recognizes that Indigenous knowledge isn't just free for the taking.
Right.
It has real value, and those who benefit from it need to ensure that Indigenous communities share in those benefits.
It's like we're starting to see a shift from viewing Indigenous knowledge as something that needs to be protected to something that can actually be a source of innovation and solutions.
Absolutely. I think that's a really important point.
So we've talked about secure land rights as this foundation.
Real space.
Participatory policymaking is this key process supporting indigenous governance systems and protecting indigenous knowledge from exploitation.
Mm-hmm.
It feels like all these pieces are really starting to come together,
Yeah.
to create a more equitable and sustainable future.
Absolutely. They all contribute to creating an environment where Indigenous knowledge can thrive and be effectively integrated into policy and governance structure. So, we've been talking about these big picture concepts, right, like land rights and governance, but I think it's important to see how these ideas actually translate into concrete policies for sustainable management.
Yeah, let's get into the nitty-gritty.
So one area where this is happening, and it's really fascinating, is fire management.
Huh.
For a long time, we've tried to suppress wildfires completely, but in places like Australia, Indigenous communities have been using controlled burns for centuries to manage landscapes. And now modern science is starting to recognize how effective those practices can be in actually reducing wildfire risk and even promoting biodiversity.
It's like we've been fighting fire with fire, literally.
Yeah, exactly.
But maybe we should be working with it in a more controlled and beneficial way.
Right. It's about understanding the natural rhythms of the land and using that knowledge to our advantage.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just fire management. The chapter highlights how Indigenous knowledge can inform policies related to water conservation, sustainable agriculture, fishing practices, you name it.
It's like there's this wealth of knowledge just waiting to be tapped into.
Yeah.
And it can help us find solutions to some of the most pressing problems we face.
Absolutely. And it's not about romanticizing the past or anything like that. It's about recognizing that Indigenous knowledge is this living, breathing system that's constantly evolving and adapting. And one of the key themes that runs through all these examples is this idea of interconnectedness.
Right.
Indigenous knowledge systems often take this really holistic approach.
They understand that everything's connected.
Exactly. The health of the land, the water, all living things are intertwined.
So it's not just about managing individual resources in isolation.
No, it's about understanding how everything fits together in this larger web of relationships.
And that's crucial for crafting policies that actually address the root causes of these environmental problems.
Exactly, not just treating the symptoms.
So maybe it's not just about tweaking existing policies,
Yeah.
but about a fundamental shift in how we approach policymaking altogether.
I think that's a really important point, and it brings us back to this idea of participatory policymaking.
Right.
It's about making sure that Indigenous communities have a genuine voice in shaping the policies that affect their lands and livelihoods.
Not just a seat at the table, but a real voice in the conversation.
Exactly.
Like those collaborative research projects in the Arctic.
Yeah, those are such great examples of how powerful it can be to bring together different ways of knowing.
Right, combining scientific data with indigenous observations and traditional knowledge.
And that leads to much more effective and culturally appropriate solutions.
It's recognizing that science doesn't have all the answers.
Yeah.
Sometimes the most valuable insights come from the people who have lived in a place for centuries.
Absolutely. And along with incorporating that knowledge, it's also about creating legal frameworks that protect it from exploitation.
Oh, right.
While also making sure it can be shared ethically.
So recognizing indigenous intellectual property rights.
Exactly.
Making sure that if their knowledge is used, it's done in a way that benefits them directly.
Yeah. And we talked about the Nagoya Protocol earlier, which is a big step in that direction. It sets these guidelines for access to genetic resources and benefit sharing.
Right.
So that Indigenous communities actually share in the benefits that come from the use of their knowledge.
It sounds like a really complex issue, but at least there are international agreements in place that are starting to address it.
Yeah, but those international agreements are just the starting point.
Right.
We need to see action at the national and local levels, too.
So governments need to actually translate those global commitments into tangible policies that support indigenous practices on the ground.
Exactly. And the chapter highlights some positive examples of this, like Bolivia and New Zealand.
Oh, yeah?
They've actually incorporated indigenous perspectives into their environmental and cultural heritage laws.
Those are definitely encouraging examples.
Yeah, but there's still a lot of work to be done globally.
For sure.
And I think the chapter really emphasizes that supporting indigenous practices goes beyond just legal recognition.
Okay.
It's about empowering communities to actually manage their resources and participate meaningfully in governance processes.
So putting the power back in the hands of the people who know these ecosystems best.
Exactly, like community-based forest management programs in Nepal. Those initiatives show that empowering local communities leads to real benefits for both the environment and the people who depend on it.
It's amazing how all these efforts are interconnected.
Yeah.
Each level plays a crucial role in creating this supportive environment for Indigenous knowledge to flourish.
It's not just about one policy or one program. It's about a holistic shift in how we think about our relationship with the environment and with the people who have been its stewards for centuries.
It's amazing to think about all the different ways that Indigenous knowledge can be applied, isn't it?
Yeah, it's not just theoretical. It's really making a difference in the world.
The chapter even touches on the revitalization of traditional food systems,
Oh, right.
like the resurgence of Indigenous seed varieties.
There's definitely a growing awareness of the importance of food sovereignty and the role that Indigenous knowledge plays in creating sustainable and resilient food systems.
And it's so interesting to see this renewed interest in foods like quinoa and chia,
Yeah.
which have been cultivated by Indigenous communities for centuries.
Exactly, and it's not just about nostalgia either.
Right.
These foods often have incredible nutritional value, and they're more adapted to local climates.
They require less water, fewer inputs, so they're more sustainable overall.
Exactly.
So it's really about looking back to move forward, finding solutions in the wisdom of the past.
Mm-hmm.
But for our listeners who are feeling really inspired by all of this, how can they actually apply these insights in their own lives?
Well, I think it starts with awareness.
So-
Educate yourself about the Indigenous communities and their knowledge systems in your own region.
Yeah.
Seek out opportunities to learn from Indigenous elders and knowledge holders.
And support organizations that are working to protect Indigenous rights and knowledge.
Absolutely. There are so many amazing groups doing really important work in this area.
And of course, advocate for policies that recognize and incorporate Indigenous perspectives.
Yes, at every level, local, regional, national, we can all use our voices to push for change.
Because ultimately, we're all interconnected, aren't we?
Yeah, we are.
To each other, to the land, to the generations that will come after us.
And Indigenous knowledge offers this incredibly valuable roadmap for navigating those complex relationships.
In a way that ensures a more just and sustainable future for everyone.
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this incredible deep dive into the world of Indigenous wisdom and its potential to shape policy and governance.
It's been a pleasure.
We hope you've learned something new and feel inspired to continue exploring this topic.
Yeah.
Be sure to check out the resources mentioned in Roots of Resilience for further learning.
Yeah, those are great resources.
Until next time, keep seeking, keep learning, and keep diving deep.